You are all very kind, and I love to come to Syracuse because I have a really knowledgeable, enthusiastic audience. Let me give you just a little bit about my background. I'm an attorney. I worked for the Commission on Judicial Conduct for many years until I retired in 2003. And in 2006, my wife got tired of me hanging around the house and suggested I should get involved in something. And so I went down, and there was a local imam, Yasin Arab, down here, who was on trial for terrorism, and so I volunteered to work with the defense on that particular case. And in due course, I spent a lot of time with Yasin and with Kathy Manley, who was also on the case. The two of us worked on it along with the partners there. And after he was convicted, I became convinced that the government had deliberately convicted an innocent man. They knew he was innocent, and they convicted him anyway. And I was absolutely puzzled by this. In all my life as a lawyer, I had never seen something quite like this. And so Kathy, I think, also felt the same way, and the two of us began to look around to see if we could understand what had happened. And we found Catherine in the group here in Syracuse that had formed around Raphael Dafir. And we began to talk and try to figure out what was there about our two cases that got us so upset. And finally, we came up with a language of talking about preemptive prosecution. The idea that the government would go after people that they maybe had a suspicion about or had some reason to be concerned about, even though they had not done anything illegal. And then they would go after them and create false charges and sort of a false hysteria and get the jury to convict them, and then send them away for these enormously long sentences, even though nothing had happened. And then we began to find there was a Hashmi, you see down there, said Fahad Hashmi. We ran into him. There's a case down in New York City. And again, we had the same experience. They came up and talked about him. He was getting preemptively prosecuted for something that he had done. Basically, the thing that he had done was to allow a friend to store a bag of clothing with him for a week when he was in his apartment in London. The bag of clothing eventually made its way to the Taliban. It was waterproof socks and ponchos. But that was enough to be material support for terrorism. Even allowing a person to store a bag with you was material support for terrorism. So he is now, how many years in jail, Kathy?
She's 17.
17.
I think.
Yasin is 15 years in jail. Raphael is 22. 22.
Hashmi might be 15.
Right. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those cases a little bit later. But that's how we formed Project Salam. The three of our groups came together. We formed Project Salam. And the idea was to document how many of these cases are across the country. And we have now approximately 800 cases that we are following. Not all of those are preemptive, but maybe as much as 600.
Something like that.
Yeah. We started to make a wall over here. The wall, we began to put names on them. I couldn't put the wall up. There's another whole panel, but even that's outdated now. But you begin to get a sense of the size, the magnitude of the number of people that we are saying have been preemptively prosecuted. These signs here, we came to later form a group called the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, partly through the Allarian family. Here we have Sammy Allarian over here. Maybe we'll talk a little bit later about that case. So at one point, the National Coalition got families of the people who had been preemptively prosecuted. And this was a particularly impacted group of people. Once the word terrorism was applied to their family, they were shunned everywhere. No one wanted anything to do with it. People lost jobs. People were abused in school. It was just a very, very difficult time. And so what we tried to do was to reach out and gather them all together and to at least let them talk about the experiences that they commonly shared. And it was very emotional, very healing, and we've been doing this now every 6 months. We try to get them all in from all over the country and have a chance to talk about it. And at one point, we decided to have a demonstration in front of the Justice Department. So we all went down in front of the Justice Department. This is part of moving from being a victim to being empowered. And we made posters of their loved ones, and these are all the posters here. And they held them up in front of the Justice Department and just wanted the Justice Department to know that they were there and that these were people who had been preemptively prosecuted. They were political prisoners, among many, many other political prisoners. And Dafir's picture. Unfortunately, it's not here because they didn't have a family member that was present down there. But we're going to make one for him. Catherine's looking at me. No, we're going to make one. We're definitely going to make one.
Is it blank?
And the sentence is that these guys are serving, the shortest is 10 years and the most is life. A lot in between there.
Yeah. And one of the ways to get a grasp on preemptive prosecution is if you just look at this wall over here and assume that there was probably 4 more walls at least that we could put up like that, of all these names of people. On those walls, if you took collectively, particularly people in green, those are the Muslims, they're serving sentences of maybe an average of 25 to 30 years, something like that. You say, wow, if they're all on an average serving 25 to 30 years, they must have done something pretty bad. Well, if you took all those cases and looked at them, there's not one person died, not one person was injured, not one piece of property was damaged. All of this because the government was suspicious. And they said, all right, we're going to go after you for what it was that we think you might do, or what we're afraid you might do, or the kind of influence that you might have on your community, we don't know, we can't tell. So we're going to make up charges. And they make up charges 2 different ways. One is that they pass material support for terrorism laws. And these laws essentially say you cannot give any kind of support to a designated terrorist organization. Well, that doesn't sound so crazy, right? I mean, we all know, bad idea to send guns to a terrorist organization, right? We shouldn't be supporting this. Money, we shouldn't be supporting that. Food, maybe, we shouldn't be supporting that. But these sanctions go much beyond that, and they were actually taken well beyond what the government itself intended. Basically, what they have done is criminalized a whole lot of things that none of us would consider to be criminal, such as charitable donations. If you knew that you could make a charitable donation to an organization that was feeding only children and widows and orphans and people that have been hurt, would you consider that to be material support for terrorism? And you'd say, no, of course not. Clothes, old clothes, just this give to people who don't have anything. Would that be? No, you'd think that wouldn't be either. And yet the government has constructed all kinds of elaborate theories on which money given, even though they acknowledge that none of the money went to fight any kind of terrorist organization, to engage in any terrorism, they would say nonetheless, just simply giving that money to this particular organization was material support for terrorism because they encouraged terrorist organizations. They raised the prestige of terrorist organizations that happened to be in the neighborhood. And that was material support for terrorism. So that, for example, is the Holy Land Foundation, Hassan Alashi down here, serving a 65-year sentence for essentially building schools and hospitals in Palestine. Schools and hospitals in Palestine. Government conceding none of the money went to support terrorism in any way. But because Hamas was working in the same area, they would say they raised the prestige of Hamas by doing that. And that was material support for terrorism. 65 years in jail for that.
And that was after a second trial.
Right. And of course we know, I think Kathy's going to talk a little bit more about Raphael, so I'm going to put that off for the moment. But his case, of course, is also one of the charity cases. But we also have free speech cases. And those become, the government says, if you say things that would materially support an organization, even though it's free speech, if it's coordinated with that organization. Now, what does coordination mean? Well, does it mean if you read the literature and then agreed with it and said, yeah, this makes sense. I want to support what they're doing over there. I'm going to say that same thing that's in the literature. If you met with a representative, would that constitute coordination? Nobody knows, and the Supreme Court won't tell us. But certainly people like Samuel Larian, down here, famous professor down in Florida, was charged with essentially doing that, was saying too many things that sounded too much like what other Palestinian groups were doing, including Hamas and some of the other designated terrorist organizations. If you were saying very much the same thing that a designated terrorist organization is saying, even if there's no proof of conspiracy, is that sufficient? And so you will see other cases around here of that. Tariq Mahana was another one over there. This was a case, this is really interesting. He felt that Americans should not be abroad attacking Muslim countries. And he encouraged, he advocated for Muslim countries to defend themselves against attack by all outside forces, including Americans. That was considered a material support for terrorism. And he is serving now, I think, 17. He also got 17 years in jail for what we would normally consider free speech. Then there's, of course, cases involving free association. These are cases in which conspiracy, what's the best one? Oh, maybe the Dukas. Yeah.
Shifa,
Or,
Ziad.
yeah, Shifa, perhaps. Or Ziad. No, Ziad. Ziad Yaghidani, one of my favorite cases. Here's a guy who was just a lovely guy, right there holding the kittens, the two kittens. I know his mother very well. She's an incredibly sweet person. And she had this son, Ziad Yaghi, and he was involved with, he knew a friend, basically. It was the Boyd family. The Boyd family had lots of ideas about things like defending Muslim communities in Bosnia. They were really big on that. And they used to talk a lot about it. But at some point, Ziad said, you know, this is not for me. And he backed out, or he stopped going over, or stopped becoming involved with it. And truth to tell, his total exposure to this family was probably no more than 24 hours at continual times that he'd been there. But the government later went to him and said, we want you to help us get the Boyds. We want you to wear a wire and go in there and talk to them and find out what they're up to. And he said, I don't do that. And they said, fine, then we're going to make your life really miserable. And what they did was they went back and discovered that at some point he decided to go visit his relatives in Palestine. And Palestine, as we know, is a third rail when it comes to these issues. And so when he went over there, he didn't have a credit card or a way to put down money, and so Boyd had offered to use the credit card and his contacts with a travel agent to get the tickets, and then was reimbursed for that. That was enough for the government to say, your association with Boyd was sufficient to raise the inference, that when you went over to Palestine, you were looking for ways to commit jihad. Now, in fact, we don't have any evidence that it was jihad. You just went, visited the parents, came back. But it doesn't matter, because we raised the inference that that's what you were looking for. And so, as part of a big conspiracy case, he was convicted and is spending 43 years in jail. 43 years in jail for one trip to visit his relatives in Palestine.
They were trying to use him against the Boyds, but then the Boyds pled and were forced to testify against him, and he got a longer sentence than they did, even though it was their conspiracy.
Yeah, and not only that, but the Boyds testified he was not involved in the conspiracy. He did not know anything about it. It didn't matter. They didn't care. They just convicted him anyway. So those are the kinds of cases that preemptive prosecution raises. And I want Kathy to talk a little bit more about some of the particular cases in this area. But what I really wanted to focus on today was a little bit about putting this into historical context so we understand it. And the reason I want to put it into a historical context is that there is a tendency by me and other people that get involved in this, that we see this as just such an important overriding civil rights issue. And we think everybody's going to immediately gravitate to it. And you go out into the public, you go to Congress, you go to talk to the president, and you just run into a stone wall. You don't get anywhere. It's just too easy to put a terrorist label on this, and people back away from it. And so what I've been trying to do is to create inclusive language that will bring in other groups and allow them to say, what's happening to the Muslims is not different than what happened to us. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, it allows us to reach out to other groups and to make connections and be able to craft language that allows us to talk to these other groups. And I wanted particularly to start with I was up at the Fonda Peace Conference. How many people went to the Fonda Peace Conference? Yes, okay, good. I thought it was outstanding. I thought every time I go up there, there's just great speakers. It's really interesting things, usually done in August, up in Fonda here. And at one point, we all were standing around, and there was an African-American gentleman named Archie. I think he was a vet. who was there, and we all went around in a circle and we were introducing ourselves. And some of the vets who were there were talking about the various campaigns that they had fought in abroad. And when it came his turn, Archie said, you know, he said, it's really interesting hearing you all talk about the wars that you fought in. He said, I think I've been fighting a war all my life. I just don't know what war it is. And I could have hugged him for it, because that was my speech. That was the kind of language I was looking for, to be able to talk about what is happening to all of us here. It is the idea of what war does and how that affects the law under which we live. War and law, in a sense, are opposites. The law presumes that everybody will be treated equally under the same set of rules. War assumes that we're going to name somebody as an enemy. There's a group that is the enemy. And once we name them as the enemy, we're going to strip them of their legal rights. We're going to go after them. We're going to mobilize all of our forces to go after them, whether it's guns or bombs, if they're abroad, if they're here domestically, we're going to take away their rights. We're going to make life here in this country really, really difficult. And perhaps the best case, because it's so obvious perhaps, was the internment of the Japanese during World War II. Here we're fighting Japan abroad, but in all of these wars there is a domestic side to it. And there were Japanese Americans of Japanese ancestry, but were American citizens here in the United States. And there was an order that was made that 110,000 of them were to be removed from the West Coast to concentration camps. And it was based supposedly on a secret study that had been made, which found that the Japanese Americans were a security risk. And so a young man, Fred Korematsu, challenged this and said, I'm not moving, I don't think I have to, I'm an American citizen. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that in times of national emergency, even though this is a racist order, it doesn't pass constitutional muster, but national security trumps it, and the order was valid. And they upheld his conviction for refusing to obey this order, this clearly racist, unsubstantiated order. And many years later, a historian went back and started to go through the records, and they discovered that, in fact, there was a secret report about the Japanese. And the secret report said, in fact, that the Japanese were not a security threat. When arguing before the Supreme Court, the Solicitor General had simply lied, told a full bald-faced lie. And on the basis of that, Fred Korematsu got his conviction reversed. And he was given the Congressional Medal of Honor. We're really sorry, so sorry about the lie. And all right, that was how the Japanese experience happened. But it's really instructive to look at this, because first of all, the Supreme Court in the Korematsu case essentially said national security trumps everything, trumps the Constitution, trumps everything. This is how we bend the law to become a weapon of war. And the second thing it teaches us, I think, is that whenever the national security is at stake, the first casualty is truth. The government will lie, they do lie, and we see this sort of pattern over and over again. So anyway, I would suggest to you that in this country, at least, we have probably 4 categories of people against whom we have always fought a domestic war. Those are the people that we have considered or classified as outsiders, as the enemy, as the people who are not entitled to the same rules as other people. And I would say the first one would be the American Indians, the African Americans, the immigrants, Latinos, and finally the communists, the leftists. Those 4 groups have, over time, consistently been put into this position of the government saying, calling national security, and then lying about it. And we see this, for example, in the McCarthy witch hunts. I think you all can relate to that. I'm going to have to skip over because I know this is a very sophisticated audience and I don't want to bog you down with things too much. So when Archie, for example, tells me, I've been fighting a war all my life, I just don't know what the war is. As an African American, I can relate to that. I understand that. He's been fighting a war in which, over and over again, he's put into a particular category, and he's treated in a particular way, which is as an outsider. It is not given the same rules as everybody else. And if you talk to immigrants, if you talk to people from Latino, particularly down from in the Southwest, you have that same story again. Again, they are the outsider, they are the enemy, they are the people that are treated differently in courts. So this has been a pattern, and I want to just focus particularly on the late 60s, 70s, with the COINTELPRO period. How many people here remember COINTELPRO? Okay, this is good. This happened to be a time at which, of course, we had the African Americans were starting to assert themselves. They had the Black Panther movement. You remember the Black Panther movement? Mm-hmm. And the Latinos, of course, were also starting to assert themselves. They even had a brown beret movement. And what's his name? Carlos Montes. He was one of those leaders. And it was also a time when you had a lot of protest against the Vietnam War, against the communists, right? The war was against the communists. So if you're protesting the war, guess what category you fitted in as far as national security was concerned. And of course, there was also the time of Wounded Knee and the Native Americans. So all these things came together at a time that the traditional four groups that have caused the government the most angst when it comes to national security. And the government formed a program to go back to attack this called COINTELPRO. And what they basically were going to do was to infiltrate these groups, to disrupt them. They were going to lie, they were going to bring false charges, and in some cases even assassinations. That is, Mark Clark, Fred Hampton were assassinated under this. So it was a real war against all four of these groups. And eventually, in 1971, some activists broke into FBI office and stole some files that had the COINTELPRO information there, and the game was